Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Let me just very briefly talk about the case for changing the law. There is an assisted dying bill currently going through the House of Lords, which is probably going to have its second reading later this year, probably in the summer. So what we're talking about is not just theoretical, it is something that is highly topical. And assisted dying relates to when somebody who's terminally ill, mentally competent, adult, is making the choice of their own free will, and after meeting strict legal safeguards, to take prescribed medicine which will end their life, medicine usually prescribed by a medic. And this is not possible at the moment, and in fact assisting someone to die may actually lead to a charge of manslaughter which carries a jail sentence of 14 years. We're not talking about assisted suicide more broadly, when chronically ill or disabled people who are not terminally ill can be given help to end their lives, nor are we talking about voluntary euthanasia, when terminally ill adults, or sometimes chronically ill or disabled adults, can have their lives ended by a doctor. In assisted dying, the last act is by the patient, although there is assistance from the clinician. I'm going to briefly touch on the case for, which is very easy, and then I'm going to touch slightly less briefly on the case against, and show how much of the case against is founded on misunderstanding. The case for is straightforward. Needless suffering at the end of life, it seems to me that the patient wishes to escape from, the patient cannot withstand, is something that I as a physician feel I ought to be able to help. And it seems to me that compassion requires that we should respect the wishes of people whose life is very near its end, whose symptoms are not responding to palliative care, that we should respond to their wish for assistance. And responding to the wish also respects something that is central for me to the practice of medicine, which is to respect patients' choices. Nobody else's views should override what a patient wants. And the third issue is, in fact, that of safety. Many of us feel at the moment the situation is so confused that actually it's rather unsafe. Those are the three reasons why we should have a change of the law along the lines that Lord Faulkner is proposing. But many people are opposed to a change in the law, and they support our arguments with not facts, but what one might politely call factoids. There's the claim that if we had assisted dying as an option, then this would stunt or reverse the development of palliative care. And we know that in many places palliative care is still not optimal. Well, the evidence from international experience is that liberalisation of the law in this area does not stunt and in fact promotes the development of palliative care. There's also the claim that it would break down trust between doctors and patients and doctors and society. There is no evidence, again, from international experience that this happens. In fact, the evidence is in the opposite direction. That it would lead to devaluation of human life, particularly of people with disabilities. There is no evidence on that. If we look very closely at Oregon, where they have a law not too dissimilar to the law that Lord Faulkner is proposing, this is not at all the case. In the Netherlands, whose laws go much further than any of us in healthcare professionals for assisted dying or dignity in dying would wish, in fact, there is no evidence that people with disability are treated badly. In fact, I have been very impressed as a geriatrician of the care of people with disability in the Netherlands. Hoogewey, the dementia village, is an absolute beacon of humane and respectful care for people with dementia. There's the idea that if we have assisted dying for people who are terminally ill, it will be extended to people who aren't dying. UK will mysteriously turn into Belgium. Assisted dying will inevitably be extended to people who aren't dying and don't wish to die and cannot express their wishes. Assisted dying will eventually become an obligation. I'm now 67, so I will have to offer myself up for metaphysical rebadging. And all of this is happening somewhere or other. That is not the case. If you take Oregon, which is a very good comparator, the proportions of death that are assisted, first of all, numerically, haven't risen significantly. They're not risen above 0.25% in the decade and a half since the Death with Dignity Act was enacted. And that would be the equivalent of 1,000 people or 1,200 people out of the roughly 500,000 deaths a year in the UK. But more importantly for the argument, the slippery slope argument, is there's been no extension of indications for assistance beyond assisted dying for terminally ill, nor is there any evidence of a public appetite for this. So the slippery slope is just a fantasy. I was once told, did you know that the number of people receiving assisted dying in Oregon had increased fourfold in the first few years? That was true. It had increased from a rather small number, 16, to a pretty small number, 71, as the law was bedded in. What about the idea that people will seek assistance to die because other people want them to die? Well, what are the frequent reasons for seeking assisted dying in Oregon? Losing autonomy, the feeling you've lost control, the desire to regain control, the inability to engage in activities making life enjoyable, and loss of dignity. All of those are things that are centred on the person who is seeking assisted dying. It's very interesting that spokespeople for particular groups are at odds with those for whom they speak. Religious leaders are pretty universally opposed to assisted dying, but their flocks are actually, in the vast majority, in support of assisted dying, on average about 75% support with people with religious beliefs. The spokespeople for people with disabilities say that we don't want assisted dying, it will devalue people with disabilities. Actually, if you survey, as has been done recently, people with disabilities, 71% support assisted dying because it's part of what people with disabilities want, which is a choice, and their choices to be respected. You may have heard that doctors are opposed to assisted dying, and indeed their representative bodies, or unrepresentative bodies, such as the BMA and the Royal College of Physicians, have a stance of opposition. The Royal College of General Practitioners is currently reviewing its position. But if you look at general practitioners, for example, a recent study found that about a third felt that their college should support a change in the law. More than a third said their college should have a neutral stance. And only a third were comfortable with their college's current stance of opposition to assisted dying. What about mistakes? If you assist someone to die, clearly it's not something you can reverse. Well, we're dealing with people with well-characterized illness, very advanced disease. And remember, doctors, on the whole, tend to be a rather optimistic crowd, and they tend to overestimate prognoses rather than underestimate them. What is more, in Lord Faulkner's bill, there's the opportunity of a pause for reflection. 14 days. If you decide that you wish to have assisted dying and you do all the appropriate processes in order to ensure that, there is a pause for reflection for 14 days. So it's not as if somebody who has fluctuating feelings is going to, as it were, at a time when they're feeling low, agree to something